a teeny bit about her. You can read the rest in the bio in your program booklet, but as you can see from what I've just said, she is an expert in her own right on this subject matter. Dr. Mendelsohn-Foreman, I turn the podium over to you to introduce the speakers. We have a very distinguished panel and to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Just a compliment to Betsy, who is one of the best organized presidents I've ever seen of an event, and I do many of them. So I think, hands off, we need to congratulate her. Thank you. It is indeed an honor, ladies and gentlemen, to be here because while I feel like I'm the spirit of post-conflict past, I also have the spirit of post-conflict present. And I loved the title of the session because optimal results is something that we all aspire to, but unfortunately the real world does not necessarily give us, given the nature that post-conflict, while a development issue, is also a security issue, is also a diplomatic issue, and is something that we all know is an ongoing question that not only our own government but the global community must deal with. So with that, I will say that there are many questions that our panelists are going to raise from three different perspectives. One, our first panelist, Elizabeth Chatvili, who I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who is currently the Deputy Assistant Administrator of USID, will speak. She will be followed by Larry Sampler, who's the Acting Principal Deputy Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at the State Department, and Dr. James Scheer, who has recently been appointed the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Partnership Strategy and Stability Operations, and he's only on the job about a week, but this is a portfolio that my colleague Jim Scheer knows very well from his previous life at the Department of Defense. I should also point out that, as Betsy has mentioned, there are extensive bios of each of these individuals, but just let me say that these three perspectives, from the AID perspective, from the State Department perspective, and the Department of Defense, demonstrate how the nexus of security and development have evolved and how the interagency collaboration has evolved since the time when we were first grappling with these issues at the end of the Cold War. And I think as you hear these presentations today, and we'll have ample time for questions, you will understand how far we've come and yet how many questions remain unresolved and need to be resolved not only by us as citizens of the United States, but by our own colleagues around the world. So first, let me give the podium over to Elizabeth, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
You're welcome to present in my place. Thank you, Johanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored today to speak before the Society for International Development, and looking out among the crowd, I see many colleagues and old friends. I appreciate the breadth of the collective experience represented in the room today. This community of practice represents enormous development wisdom and operational insight on the challenges we as development actors are facing in today's increasingly complicated world. I hope my few comments will challenge us to think beyond our comfort level and to press us just a little bit to be a little bit bolder in our thinking. All of our organizations are facing a daunting array of interconnected problems: the global financial crisis, alarming food insecurity, weakened states with little capacity to govern themselves, violent threats from conflict entrepreneurs, all of which infinitely complicate the development challenge we collectively seek to address. In the face of these challenges, we as development actors must become better prepared to adapt and respond. We must fundamentally reconsider and ultimately transform our traditional ways of engaging these difficult problems and their daily manifestations. Many here in Washington have named a more thoughtful approach, a transformed or integrated approach, smart power, a term which has come to signify the appropriate harmonization between hard military and soft civilian power tools and resources. Understanding smart power has pushed us to re-examine our foreign policy tools and consider how best to update them for the 21st century. The creation of SCRS and the Civilian Response Corps are manifestations of some of these valuable new tools, as is, I hope, the continuing revitalization of my own agency. What I'd like to focus on today, however, is not the architecture of this approach, leaving that for my colleagues and the Q&A later on, but rather the philosophical orientation behind our soft power approach. In other words, smart development practices in R&S environments. There is considerable discussion in Washington on critical structural reforms USAID must undertake to become a transformed development agency and a faster, more responsive interagency partner, flexible enough to link short and long-term responses based on adequate analysis of these complex situations. Many of you are leading these discussions, and your contributions to the debate on what will make USAID the standard bearer for U.S. government development implementation is indeed welcomed. The reforms being discussed are absolutely essential and long overdue. Perhaps an equally challenging consideration, however, is how to build new partnerships and achieve impact in complex or post-conflict environments. In this regard, I'm standing in the shadow of many intellectual giants who have broken critical ground in considering how to fix failed states, while pursuing new modalities of development assistance in general and specifically in R&S situations. I'm grateful for the work of Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart of the Institute of State Effectiveness, whose new book, Fixing Failed States, argues for a reorientation in donor practice in building effective, capable states. They outline core state functions and then explore pragmatic ways for implementing the goal and functions of capable states. Many of the best practices they articulate should, in my humble opinion, be adopted by development actors, and I'll highlight in a moment which ones resonate most deeply with me. I think it was Ashraf who once lectured me by saying USAID is using 20th century practices to address 21st century problems. Their book, in addition to my own personal experience working in many fragile or conflict environments, crystallized for me USAID's own mixed experiences in state building. It's clear in all contexts, not just in R&S environments, that USAID and other donors need to stop trying to be in the lead. We must move away from practices which, albeit inadvertently, cultivate aid dependency and which continuously project and then seek to build Western-centric approaches or institutions on top of culturally distinct practices and orientations. In fact, we must now contend with a backlash against globalization in many of the countries in which we work. To quote from The Accidental Gorilla by my friend David Kilcullen, quote, "Traditional societies have experienced the effects of globalization on deeply held social, cultural, and religious identities, sparking violent antagonism to Western-led modernization and its preeminent symbol, the perceived U.S. cultural and economic imperialism," unquote. Perhaps not having learned from our experiences in many countries, especially in weak, conflict-affected states, we, in a very well-intentioned manner, see ourselves as coming to the rescue. So often the political imperatives of a response to a state in crisis push us as donors to default to doing things for the host country, pushing our own ideas of institution building, bypassing in some countries host nation budgetary processes because of lack of capacity or corruption. Each of these choices undercuts our ultimate success in partnering to build stronger, more effective, and legitimate states. So if we hold ourselves to a higher standard of not continuing to repeat some of the mistakes of state building in the past, how should we chart a development and R&S approach for the 21st century using this century's best practices? I'll use my remaining time to highlight 3 critical themes to reorient our soft power approach to development assistance in R&S situations to avoid repeating the same mistakes in the future. 1, building new partnerships among the donor community and with host nation communities and governments, characterized by joint responsibility, mutual accountability, and local ownership, as codified in the Paris Declaration. 2, indigenization or alignment, as called for in the Paris Declaration, a recognition and commitment to stop projecting in every case our norms and systems in favor of support for more locally adapted models and approaches to community development. And 3, a new orientation toward and true commitment to capacity building, especially in environments where we as donors are tempted to act for the government or to default to a do-it-for-them approach. Use these 3 principles as a general framework for how we need to operate where circumstances permit. Partnership model. I know that the imperatives of cultivating new and different partnerships and seeking meaningful local ownership is quite clear to this audience. What is much more difficult is actually forging trusting, inclusive partnerships built on mutual accountability and true local ownership over the development process and impact, and validating those partnerships by ensuring we all deliver on commitments. A true partnership model calls for collaboration among new development actors, both in a host country and between donor countries. There are now a proliferation of new organizations, even countries, pursuing development, each of which has its own philosophical orientation and unique business model. New donors such as China, Brazil, the Arab states, and India have exploded onto the scene, offering unique capabilities and certainly different development models for host nations to choose among. USAID is forging partnerships with these new donors and really is taking the time to examine which each of them is offering and how their approaches may differ from our own. For example, if India were to partner with Nepal on a parliamentary strengthening system, how would it differ from USAID's own traditional legislative strengthening program? Is the India model better suited for its neighbor Nepal or not? Critically, many conflict-affected countries or weak and failing states, government legitimacy is at the core of the conflict or institutional vulnerability. And yet it is widely accepted that legitimacy can't and should never be imposed from the outside. As donors, we must tread very carefully here. We may seek to balance our approach between investing directly in capacity building for the host nation while also cultivating strong civil society networks who are empowered to demand accountability and monitor human rights. However, if we are really conscientious about not overly projecting our Western ideals of pluralism, we must first listen intently to the host nation's intentions, demands, and expectations about how they are pursuing legitimizing processes. Then we will be better prepared to support their unique visions for building legitimacy and accountability between the governing and the governed. Here, Mary Anderson's Listening Project may provide insights we could all benefit from as we think about this issue. There is a wide range of potential partnership models with different organizations and government actors with host nations that USAID is pursuing. In Colombia, for example, we are supporting the Colombian government's democratic security strategy to extend state presence to recently recovered areas. Donors in Colombia are supporting a strong state in achieving its own unique vision for cultivating trust between the governed and the governing populations. Unfortunately, unlike the case in Colombia, we haven't always been successful in our endeavors to support locally driven, legitimate institution building processes, but we are trying. Indigenization. What I mean when I call for greater indigenization of development models is the search for locally influenced and adaptive approaches to good governance, legitimacy, meeting human security needs, and the provision of services. Many host nation communities are throwing up the brakes and asking us to stop overwhelming them with our westernization, our brand of morality, our particularly Americanized approach. A good example of a constructive and locally adapted approach is the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan. It uniquely binds social and political capital of a range of actors, local and international NGOs, villagers and community leaders, the local and national government of Afghanistan, to pursue community development in a culturally appropriate way. It draws on the leadership and community influence of elected and trusted community development councils to achieve sound, needs-driven community development. Finally, capacity building. Being in the capacity building business cannot continue to mean seeking solutions to problems by acting for or on behalf of host nation partners. 30 years ago, USAID invested in its officers who served in many places around the globe as capable advisors and mentors who formed long-standing professional relationships with their host country counterparts to build true governance and deliver services. And yet, in RNS environments, there is a fundamental tension between investing in medium to long-term capacity building programs and needing to quickly stabilize or arrest violent conflict. This tension has not been reconciled, In fact, our short-term and ad hoc solutions to this challenge may have undercut long-term stability in countries like Afghanistan. Several current and former USAID officers are calling for a reevaluation of these practices, and while the provision of technical assistance will remain an important component of many donors' business models, it must be balanced by better host country leaders and government managers who seek to address their own challenges, perhaps by using donor advisors embedded in their offices and ministries. And in conclusion, true partnership models offer great power and potential for cultivating local ownership and ensuring development impact. Indigenization of our models and approaches must be fueled by a continuous search for creative, culturally based approaches to community development. And we must pursue a model of capacity building which truly honors the host nation as the lead. Just as my military colleagues tell me that their role is to support the civilians in USAID, so too our role should be in support, providing mentorship and advice as a true partner in achieving development and stability. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. I am going to use PowerPoint. I heard Betsy told me no one was using our PowerPoint. I said, we can't do that after lunch. PowerPoint's kind of de rigueur from the U.S. government these days, and so I'm going to use PowerPoint. I could actually do this quite quickly. The question and the challenge is creating optimal outcomes in post-conflict recovery and reconstruction. And this is a shameless plug. But Oxfam and CAP did a White Oaks paper just a few months ago, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to pull it up and look at it. I don't agree with everything in it. It was a fascinating weekend with some people who I truly consider to be heroes, both in terms of development and diplomacy abroad, but it is a fascinating and a very useful first cut at ways to improve the effectiveness of U.S. development overseas. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a humbling experience, and if my wife were here, she would say you should be humbled to be in this crowd. And I have to start out by saying that my opinions are only my own. I do represent my office at the Department of State, the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, but the things that I'm going to say today, I intend to be a little bit more provocative than perhaps my boss would have me be, and to do it in 12 minutes. Zach, would you do the next slide, please? I always owe you an outline. I'm going to just cover 6 points. In a setting like this one, with this many incredibly talented and experienced people, there's in my opinion, a tendency to overthink things. And so I'm going to play the dumb guy at the party and focus on some kind of low-level, not so important issues that, given enough examination, become maybe more important than we originally thought. I will throw a few grenades on the table, some Quixotic tilting at sacred windmills to mix metaphors, and I hope that during the question and answers we'll pick some of that up.
Throw them that way.
I'm sorry?
Throw them that way, not
yeah, throw them that way. I noticed on the program for this reconstruction and recovery. My office is reconstruction and stabilization. Now, if I were, as we in the government tend to be, paranoid, I would think you did that on purpose. You don't want to do stabilization. You want to focus and skip straight to the recovery part because that's where your true passion lies and that's where your expertise is. And there are probably budgetary consequences of this omission of stabilization. I did just come from a conference similar to this in Paris where we argued for about an hour whether or not they were correct to call it stabilization and reconstruction or we were correct to call it reconstruction and stabilization. This is true. Truth is stranger than fiction sometime. Zach, next slide. Let me just start by hitting the nature of the intervention. I frequently find when I attend large groups of people within the U.S. government that we think we're talking about the same thing when, in fact, we're not. We're talking about different things. When I talk about post-conflict interventions, they're typically multinational and multilateral, meaning they involve NGOs, international organizations, non-state actors. They're typically some sort of stabilization, transformation, or reconstruction activity. They may have all those. It may be in that order. It may not. It's typically less than a peaceful environment. The whole notion of post-conflict is laughable. For those of you who've been there, you know, post-conflict is in the eye of the beholder. When I was in the military, we had a saying, no conflict is low intensity when you're caught in the middle of it. So this notion of post-conflict is somewhat questionable. There are typically some sort of constraints that have to do with the security of our international and domestic partners. It may be an international military force, it may be a domestic security force, but there's some sort of international or domestic security presence that we have to work with. I included a quote from the Devil's Dictionary, which I think is actually more accurate than not, about the notion of the alliances and the peace that we're seeking. Devil's Dictionary, for those of you who can't read it, is the period in international politics is the union of two thieves who have their hands so deeply in each other's pockets they can't possibly plunder a third party. And peace is defined in the dictionary as a period of cheating between two periods of fighting, which unfortunately I think is more true than not. Zach? I use this slide a lot, and I apologize if some of you have seen it before, but it's my first challenge with respect to how we can optimize our outcomes. If you look at this slide, and if I asked you to write down on a piece of paper what you see, I would get 2 or 3 different answers. And in fact, I've used this slide for probably 3 or 4 years, and only a few months ago did somebody point out to me, not only is there a beautiful young maiden and what they call the old crone, but there's also a Scotsman with a mustache there. Now, being a healthy heterosexual male, I block out the Scotsman. I don't like all that facial hair. But you can see any of the 3. But the nature of a gestalt, I'm told, is that you can never see all 3 at once. And as we move into more sophistication and more capacity building of our own ability to optimize our outcomes, one of the things that we as policymakers and we as practitioners have to be able to do is move from a gestalt where you can only see one perspective at a time to a sort of a paradigm. Whereas Dr. Slaughter was talking about, through evidentiary and science-based thinking, we can evaluate multiple different perspectives at the same time. Zach, next slide. This one is another slide that I use, and I think it's a slightly different problem that we face in terms of maximizing our outcomes. You perhaps know the parable of the 6 blind men describing an elephant. It's a continent of India story. 6 blind men, each speaking a different language, are tasked to describe an elephant. Each one of them describes their piece of the elephant in their native tongue, and they do it correctly, and they do it superbly, and in some cases poetically. But the point here is each of them, though correct, none of them are sufficient. And what's actually missing is the interlocutor who speaks all 6 languages and who can integrate the 6 necessary but not sufficient definitions into a holistic perspective. And I hope we'll talk more about common operating perspectives and common vision, unity of vision, and unity of effort. Those are some of the things that I think are necessary if we're truly going to optimize our outcomes. Next slide. Hit it again, if you don't mind. This slide is going to build, and the point of this one, I use this one when I talk to UN audiences. What we think is an optimal outcome depends on who we are. You're looking at a set of swing sets that are building under a tree, and the big slide is telling you what each of the different actors thought they were asking for. Was it a simple swing set? What the NGOs prefer, which is nothing at all perhaps? What the contractor wanted to provide? What the field had actually requested? This slide is not meant to be merely entertaining. It's meant to keep you awake after lunch. But it's also meant to point out that what we see depends on where we sit. If you are a congressional staffer, if you're on the staff of one of the appropriating committees, your perspective of a particular program in a particular country is different than if you're the person in the field who's actually trying to execute that program. Next slide. Hit it one more time. This one, I think, highlights that point specifically. Metrics are enormously important. Dr. Slaughter spoke, and here's where I somewhat disagree with the notion of science-based or evidence-based metrics in decision-making. How do you impose evidence-based metrics on conflict prevention? You can't. It's epistemologically not possible to prove you prevented a conflict. You can accumulate anecdotes, but how do you prove that you prevented a conflict? How do you impose these kinds of metrics on a program like American Libraries or the Fulbright Scholarship Program, where the value of those programs is evidenced over decades, not months and not even years, but decades? So I have a problem when we talk, and I understand the tension. There's a need to be accountable to the American taxpayers. And to the voters who vote for the politicians who in turn fund our projects. But we also need to constantly push back against this attempt to overly muscularize and overly create metrics that are overly quantifiable and scientific. Next slide. These are 2 points, and I think they're about the last 2 that I'll make. I tell people frequently pronouns are important, and that's what do we mean by we? This is relevant both inside agencies, where within USAID, those of you who know the agency know that the bureau you're talking to may not be in necessarily the best of graces with other bureaus. It's also relevant among the interagency. One of my great frustrations and great challenges in SCRS is working with people who all draw taxpayer dollars as employees of the U.S. government, but there is no collective we involved in this process. I mean, the bureaucracy of the U.S. government is as fractured as any. People say, well, it was worse when you were with the UN, and I have to tell them, no, it really wasn't. It was very similar. These large organizations produce equities and loyalties that are often quite divisive. The next slide, please. The myth of the international community. This is one of my favorites. When I was in Kabul for 3 or 4 years, and before that in Sarajevo, people would say, well, the international community will take care of something. And that's not true. It's not even possible for that to be true. The international community in Kabul no more exists than does an international community in the business class lounge at Heathrow Airport. It's a lot of international people speaking a lot of languages, all of them in the same physical place at one time, but for different reasons. They may be competitors, they may like each other, they may not, but you certainly can't describe them as a community. Last slide. There's an issue of being involved or being committed. I think it's an important one. For those who can't see the slide, when you have bacon and eggs for breakfast, the pig is committed, the chicken's just involved. It's okay for the military or for certain agencies to just be there for a while. But there are NGOs and there are others who've been there for decades, and we need to recognize the differences and the consequences of those differences. And then the really last slide is go ahead and hit it 3 times. These are my solutions, and it's just 3 small ones. There's dozens, and I hope we'll talk during Q&A about them. How can we define who the actors are and establish responsible roles among them? How can we identify and empower, to some degree, a first among equals who leads the engagement? And how can we establish common metrics that we can at least all agree to disagree about, but some set of metrics that we can use to evaluate whether or not we're actually making progress towards optimization? Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and to SID colleagues and some new friends. I'm delighted to be here. As you know, my name is Jim Scheer, and I just want to say at the very outset, this may be the first time in history that the State Department colleague has shown up with PowerPoint and the Defense Department colleague is bereft of PowerPoint. So you're covered, and maybe there's a capacity building issue there. Anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to join with my good friend Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman and my colleagues Larry Sampler and Elizabeth Katashvili for this panel this afternoon. As you've heard from Johanna, I'm a newbie here. I've been in office exactly for 1 week. And as a consequence, I don't think you'll be too surprised when I say that I'm not here to preach or pronounce on policy, but perhaps I can offer some personal views, and I'm speaking in a personal capacity here, and then to enjoy learning a bit from the diverse range of perspectives here present in the room today. I've already learned a lot from my 2 colleagues. The question that this panel is wrestling with, how to assure successful outcomes, obviously defies a simple or straightforward response. To start with, those of you, and a lot of you I suspect here in this room, have field experience and comparative field experiences. And so you probably know there are a variety of pathways out of conflict, and we've seen them over the past 20 years. As the Cold War subsided, some conflicts were brought to closure through the constructive disengagement of the great powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and their allies, in places from Central America to Southern Africa and Southeast Asia. Transitional authorities were established Foreign fighters went home, whether you were a Cuban in Africa or Vietnamese in Cambodia. Internationally mandated peacekeepers flowed in. Programs for disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration got some traction. Elections were organized, roads were cleared, bridges were rebuilt, refugees returned home, market access was reestablished for farmers and merchants, miners and textile makers. Those were the easy cases. There are other pathways, and they're much more forbidding and much more difficult. Coercive interventions were needed in places like Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, Sierra Leone, in order to help bring those conflicts to closure, and hopefully not to reoccur. And in our two most current, our challenging and current venues, Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. led forced entry campaigns into those countries to oust pariah regimes, managed to establish new governments in the process, but our leaders at the time greatly underestimated what it would take to orchestrate successful stabilization and reconstruction campaigns to offset a rising tide of insurgency. And here I have to say, Larry, I side with the French. I like the stabilization first, but we can talk about it. So the pathways vary considerably, which brings me to my second point, and that is that the strategies and resources that we've sought to mobilize for this complex mission really do span traditional, professional, and bureaucratic boundaries within our national security policy community. Absolutely the case. This is inherently a joint civilian-military enterprise, one that, as Secretary Gates, my boss, has stressed over and over again, soldiers simply cannot do alone. But I have to also add that turning that essential insight into concerted action is very, very difficult. We have to, on each side of the fence, toss aside some outdated perceptions. Just as military commanders have to move beyond the notion that irregular warfare is basically about destroying the enemy as opposed to protecting local communities, our diplomats and our aid providers must let go of the notion that they can stay on the sidelines until the smoke clears. And they are letting go, and very impressively so. The sentiments that a great 19th century European diplomat once expressed to a military colleague, that when my profession fails, yours comes to the rescue, that really turns out to be a pretty poor guide for figuring out who does what and when in today's contested zones. Indeed, while it is certainly fair to ask whether foreign assistance instruments are becoming over-militarized, it's also worth underscoring the extent to which today's conflicts environments are becoming progressively more civilianized due to the vital importance of the contested state-building tasks upon which decisive outcomes hinge. Now, from the defense standpoint, much work has been done to identify the military's core competencies in stabilization and reconstruction missions. I would commend to you, for example, the Army's new Stability Operations Field Manual, FM 3-07, which was just released a few months ago. It works very judiciously through a full range of essential stability tasks, drawing on a lot of good existing work. Identifies the enforcement of ceasefires and conducting security sector reform, all the way to extending protection over key facilities and vulnerable populations. What is very apparent is how much the S&R effort, even in its earliest phases, needs readily available civilian expertise and resources for everything from work programs for unemployed youth to the restoration of essential services or the vetting of local police recruits. And that raises the obvious question of using our military units to cover these needs as an interim stopgap measure, which very frequently, all too frequently perhaps, has been the case. Overall, we've learned a great deal about who should do what in these S&R venues. And you've heard from my colleagues about some ways to think about these challenges. The issue I'd like to put on the table in my remaining few minutes is how we can strive to build stronger and more mutually beneficial civil-military relations. Some of the challenges that we face in this regard are amenable to greater infusions of resources and expertise. Other challenges are not. They reflect inherent structural tensions which can be managed but not ultimately fully resolved or set aside. So to embellish a bit upon Reinhold Niebuhr's prayerful plea, we need the courage to overcome those obstacles which can be overcome, and I would say the tenacity to try and figure out workarounds for the challenges that can't be overcome, and the wisdom to know the difference between the two. Which obstacles can be overcome? I think there are 4 that strike me as opportune, and progress is being made on all of them. First, we can do better at filling key informational and analytic deficits. I continue to be impressed that despite improvement, U.S. agencies still have a very long way to go in building a better knowledge base for current or likely operating venues. Improved situational awareness would help in shaping the terms of entry and generating better estimates of how interventions will reshape conflict dynamics within the country or region in question. Moreover, once deployed, information sharing between military and civilian elements remains difficult. Procedures need to be further refined so that data that are relevant for humanitarian or developmental purposes can default into a common user space, unless there is another purpose for that information and it's sorted into a classified channel. But we have to do better at improving information sharing in operational settings. Look forward to hear more about that from SCRS and other colleagues. Secondly, improving our own self-knowledge. We pay it lip service all the time, but good lessons learned analysis does remain very hard to do. Within the defense community, despite some recent improvement, after-action reporting still remains pretty much the preserve of specific commands and military services. On the civilian side, the endeavor is developing some speed, but it has a ways to go. What's needed is a well-honed interagency process which can cull out and review incoming assessments from a growing array of sources, the blogosphere, commissioned studies, debriefings, using an widely agreed methodology for doing this. Such a process also would be a valuable corrective against the risk of overlearning, of proffering up one experience in one venue as a best practice with broad applicability to every other case. Third, we can improve, I think, improve capacity building at the retail level. I won't go into provincial reconstruction efforts here. So much has been discussed and debated. I'll simply note that the way ahead is still open, I think, for clearer interagency guidance on the planning and execution of projects done at the provincial level, for funding streams on the civilian side that are as flexible and responsive as those which have been available to military commanders, and more extensive team building, although there is some progress to report there, but it's more extensive team building so that the break-in time for newly arriving personnel on a site is as time compressed as possible. Finally, I think there's more we can do to remedy key capabilities and services shortfalls. Meeting the equipment needs of expeditionary elements, civil or military, in non-permissive environments is an ongoing challenge, as is providing comparable medical and other support for civilian personnel and contractors deployed by various agencies. Complex S&R operations draw heavily upon capabilities that the U.S. military, U.S. defense community has found it hard to mobilize: armored vehicles, non-lethal weapons, rapidly deployable demining and explosive ordnance disposal, anti-air defense systems, IED countermeasures. The list goes on. Progress is being made, but I think more can be made. Finally, what must be worked around? And I have 4 here, but I'll just tick them off quickly because I think I'm overstepping my time, or I'm just about to. First of all, We need to take steps, and I think we can, to smooth over tensions between diplomatic crisis managers on the one hand and expeditionary planners on the other. Whenever the U.S. takes a lead role in managing a brewing crisis, there is always going to be an inbuilt tension between these two communities. We've seen this vividly in the Balkans, in West Africa, and other regions. Crisis managers want to control the message being conveyed to foreign interlocutors for perfectly understandable reasons. They're concerned about press leaks. They therefore tend to be exclusive, to pull the circle very tight. Planners, by contrast, need to tap every available stakeholder that has authorities or resources to bring to the operation. They need to be inclusive. They need to draw the circle as widely as possible. The resulting problems can be predictable. Planning is delayed. A rush to finalize a peace settlement, if one materializes, generates pressure for quick decisions on force commitments, and implementers begin to pick apart the agreement at its weakest points. The best way to contain these tensions is to ensure that crisis managers have available a few dedicated, capable planners in their midst to advise on the upstream practicalities before the agreement is implemented and moves downstream. Secondly, there are issues, as Elizabeth mentioned, between balancing the short-term stability perspective and the longer-term reform perspective, and I won't go into that in detail now except to acknowledge that both perspectives are going to be there, and we have to work with them and through them. Thirdly, we have to understand and be content, not be content, but we have to understand that we are consistently going to have to manage tensions between partisan and impartial actors, between NGOs that see impartiality as key to their operational effectiveness and to their protection, as against those who are inevitably partisan actors on the battlefield. That's a big issue. There is no easy solution. Communication is important. To paraphrase Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner in another context, we probably are in different boats, but we're all heading into the same storm. Finally, we need to be better at managing competing lines of authority. At the end of the day, in a large mission, the mission's leading civilian officer and military commander are going to be working up through their respective chains. And there will be a need for consensus and team building through them, even if there's a clear line of authority. Ultimately, I think the American public has good reason to be worried about launching or seeing its leadership launch complex S&R contingencies, given how polarizing nation-building and counterinsurgency have been over the last half-century. On the other hand, prevailing strategic conditions are not going to change anytime soon. We have to look and be ready to make tough decisions when the case arises. And I would say greater preparedness is not a license for wasteful, ill-advised intervention. It's, in the end, a safeguard against them. Thank you very much.
Well, let me thank all three speakers for doing a wonderful job in their presentations and for also keeping within the strict time frame so we can allow members of our audience to ask the questions that they need to ask. I just wanted to make one quick plug for Smart Power in that CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, did a Smart Power Commission and discussed some of these issues. So for those of you who haven't seen that, you can also go to the CSIS website. But as we know, the developmentalization of security, or the securitization of development, is a topic that you can hear is not going away. And I'm sure many of you in the audience have thought long and hard about how to approach what seem like contradictory yet converging issues that need to be at the center of any kind of work we are doing in the area of stabilization and reconstruction. We have microphones roving around the room. We have about 40 minutes left for this session, and if you would raise your hand, I'll call on you. I have a little difficulty seeing because of the lights, but I know that our talented people in the back have identified questions. So please go ahead, and we'll pass them either to a panelist, or you can name a group of people you want to answer them. Thanks. Do we have a first question? I think there was somebody over here at this table. Yes. There's a gentleman at this table over in the corner here.
I'm sorry.
Or, okay. Could you please, when you finally get the microphone, if you could state your name for the panelists so they know whom they're talking to? Thank you.
I hope this is a question that's worthy of the effort to get here. I'm Doug Kinsler with Chemonics International. Suppose a hypothetical country in a hypothetical situation, which I know probably a number, particularly of the contracting community, have encountered in their experiences, where you're a contractor working in a conflict zone where there's active conflict, and you are a contractor doing development with no security clearance. The military is active in the area. There's a lot that you could offer the military in the post-kinetic thing for development interventions, but the parties don't talk because there's a security vacuum. The contractor is not with security clearance, and a situation is you've got a stovepipe situation that leads to less than optimal solution. It's a hypothetical situation, but I can say from our own experience it's real, and I suspect it happens more often than not.
Okay. Is this for the whole panel, sir? Or okay. Who wants to start?
Is it ladies first? No, thanks. I'll be honest, I don't have a good answer. If I did, I think from an AID perspective, we would have already tried to implement something to address that very concern, because whether it's Chemonics or any of our other implementing partners, we know that whether it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Bosnia, countries in Africa from the past, you have been put in increasingly difficult security situations. I would offer the following thought, however. And again, I speak as Elizabeth Kvitashvili, not USAID in this perspective, because we are having this internal discussion, but we'll wait for the new administration to perhaps give us guidance on where they think we should go with this. And that is, should we be doing development in the face of active combat? I don't know. Some would say that you need to address the underlying causes, the root causes of why there is conflict through a developmental lens, whether it's addressing governance or livelihoods or the development or delivery of health and education services. So you need to do that in order to address the underlying root causes so people perhaps won't choose violence. However, as you've already said, how can you do that without inherent security? And if security is to be provided by the host country and they don't have the capacity, is there an expectation that our military counterparts are to provide it? I'm not going to speak on their behalf, but I think they've in the past said, no, that's not their role, and I wouldn't suggest that it might be. But I come back to the question then, should we be doing development in the face of active combat? And I do not have an answer for that.
I do, convenient. I actually think it's impossible in the current environment to separate. There, better? I think it's impossible to separate conflict and non-conflict. To use another hypothetical, but Afghanistan, where I spent 3 or 4 years of my life recently, in a given province on a given month, you're post-conflict or you're in a reasonably stable environment, and then suddenly you're not. And then the season passes and it's back into a stable environment. And unless you're going to set up a revolving door of who's in and who's out, you can't say, I will only do X in one context or the other. I do think Elizabeth's right that you asked the foundational question, but for practitioners, be they corporate or NGOs or not-for-profits or the U.S. government, we're there. There's some optimism. The Ambassador Wood and General McKiernan have set up in Afghanistan, just a specific example, something called the Interagency Civil Military Action Group, the ICMAG. It's in the embassy. It reports to the Deputy Chief of Mission. It has his full support and authority behind it. It also is attended by a 2-star general on the military side. And it's an attempt to address exactly what you're saying, where capacities emerge in one particular stovepipe, to use your language, that can be laterally useful. The ICMAG is the point, if it doesn't happen at a lower level, where that can happen. I will also say in my field experience, if we let captains be captains and FS3s be FS3s, they will find ways to laterally pass information. And the problem with interagency coordination and multilateral coordination isn't at the tactical level, it's at the operational and the strategic levels. But we're trying to address that through this ICMAG, and I'm happy to talk offline more about that if you're interested.
Okay. Jim, did you want to contribute to that, or do you? Okay. Before we go on to, I really have problems with the light scene, so I'm going to rely on the good efforts of SID staff to help. But let me just ask you a quick question to the panel. You've talked about, Elizabeth, a new role or new vision of development, of local capacity building, of ownership, the way that Ashraf Ghani has described it. How is USAID currently trying to use some of those concepts in its own effort to work in some tough environments such as Afghanistan or in Iraq? And you can use other countries, I just mentioned those.
You mentioned new, and I think we would all agree that those are not new ideas. We as a community have been talking about local ownership, capacity building since development started. So they're not new concepts. I think, and I wanted to say in my comments, but I didn't, we talk a good talk. We don't necessarily walk a good walk. And by that I mean, I mentioned in my comments, and Larry addressed this as well, we are so eager to address the problem that perhaps we get out of front of ourselves. So we do want to build capacity, but as both Jim and Larry have said, we have this imperative to fix the problem today. And we may not have time, and it takes a long time, as we said, to build capacity of our counterparts to be able to do all these things. Where we have the luxury of intervening within a country, or engaging in a country, I should say, in a country where there is capacity, and it's just a question of building that capacity. I think we tend to have more patience. But as of late, because we've been engaging in many countries where capacity has been extraordinarily low, and because the mandate, the metrics have proven to be the bane of our existence in many cases, we've been unable to deal with the longer term consequences of what it means to do development smartly, because as we all know, it takes a long time to put successful development programs that are sustainable, that have local ownership in place. It's not the one-off projects, of which we've been very successful. It's that long-term growth we want to put in place. And so we know what we want to do. We've just, in some ways, not kept up with our own mantra.
Thank you. Audience? Oh, please.
I don't disagree with anything. I don't disagree with anything that Elizabeth said, but I will put a marker down. Local ownership is the new bling. It's the new phrase of the day. For a while it was rule of law, and then it was democracy, and it'll be something else in 5 or 10 years. I was in Afghanistan when Elizabeth was in 2002 and 2003, and I would only temper the notion of local ownership with appropriate capacity. Had we turned the emergency loi jirga and the constitutional loi jirga in Afghanistan over to local ownership initially, it would not have succeeded. And there's a healthy and a delicate tension and a balance that we have to maintain between building institutional capability, which means that you let them do it, and you let them fail and stumble and fall if necessary, but you let them do it, and our need to deliver. And when our assistance is being provided in support of the global war on terror, for example, we can't wait the years or the decades for the institutional capability to be built. So I would like us to, instead of using the expression of just local ownership, to talk about institutional capacity and local ownership together. It's just a nuance, I guess.
Thank you. I saw somebody in the middle who had a question. Sir?
Yes, Steve McCarthy from ACDI VOCA. It may be too early to tell, but under the new administration, this is a question across agencies. Do you, in your deliberations with colleagues from other organizations in other forum in other countries, is there a growing consensus about the use of smart power amongst the European our European colleagues and others, so that we are building more of a global consensus on how to do this versus going it alone?
The short answer is absolutely. I think there's been an appetite among our international counterparts to see us becoming more conscious of and more sophisticated in our ability to exercise smart power. SCRS, my office, the State Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization, is engaged with, at a core level, 5 countries, and at a larger level, almost 20 countries who are developing some of the same comprehensive approaches or whole-of-government approaches to exercising smart power. So absolutely there's an appetite. And the challenge now for us collectively internationally is coordination mechanisms. We call it whole-of-government, they call it comprehensive, we call it S&R, they call it R&S, those kinds of issues. But absolutely there's an appetite.
I actually claim to have the soft side of hard power portfolio over in the Pentagon, but I'm very drawn to the concept, and my mentor and former mentor Joe Nye was instrumental in that. I would say, though, that with the whole of government approach, one has to balance that out. Inclusion, as I sort of said, inclusion has virtue, great virtue, and getting insight, but the community has to be able to concentrate, focus, and move issues for decision up to up to the apex, and that's true in the field. It's true back in Washington. So. The architecture or the process, if you will, that we try to use to, galvanize or energize smart power is really a challenge, because everyone has different elements of the power in their pocket that they're bringing to the table. The UN is one that is a source of power and legitimacy that certainly this administration will be paying close attention to. I would also have to point out that within this area, it is an overstretched institution. If you look how many peacekeepers, to include civilian police, are deployed around the world, it is very significant. And in many cases, it's, as the Foreign Policy magazine recently labeled, soldiers of misfortune, because their mandates are so hopelessly in excess of what they can deliver. So. Part of the success effort in the UN, I hope, will be to relook how it does business and concentrate on areas where it can deliver success. Just a personal thought. Elizabeth?
Thank you, gentlemen. I'll just say one word, and that is, I think while our allies in this discussion have struggled like we have with the architecture, I think by and large they, like we, are also now focused more on the philosophical orientation. Okay, we're still struggling, our various roles and responsibilities, and that will continue to evolve depending on the situation. But now I think the focus is going to be more on to what ends? What are we attempting to do, and what is the process by which we support the change we're seeking to support? Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question there, but I want to put one quick question to the panel, and that is based on your comments. We are going to have a quadrennial defense review taking place, or is in the process of starting right now, and it's going to address precisely some of the issues that you've discussed about whole-of-government approaches, how we deal with civil-military relations, how we deal with capacities. So I'd like you to think about that and perhaps respond, and also take a question that is out in the far corners of the room, and then we can have you respond to both of those issues. Thank you.
Hi, Sean Callahan with Catholic Relief Services. Appreciate the comments that you've all made. I said, first of all, though, I think in conflict situations, there's no question that we have to do development. Any of you who have worked in Afghanistan, Pakistan, now Sri Lanka, education for girls, health care for people, farming for the small agriculturalists, we have to be doing those type of initiatives. My concern is what was raised here is capacity building. You can't just hand it over, and we all agree that we have to build that local capacity. But currently our mechanisms really force us to choose between the urgent and the strategic, the longer-term investments. To me, the big question is, what mechanism is the administration going to put in place that allows long-term development that's sustainable, that's needed, as opposed to having us move from one area or another to the country, to one population to another? What we really need is long-term sustainable development if we're going to have a realistic chance to succeed.
I see Elizabeth nodding her head, and I think she should start the responses.
Thanks, Sean. You know, when I said earlier, I was positing a question, should we be doing, the global development in the midst of conflict? I wasn't suggesting we shouldn't be. It's a question each organization, each institution has to ask for itself. Institutions have chosen, and I'm glad to hear that. But when I get the question about security, I only pose it back to you. It's up to the institutions to decide. Now, specifically on Afghanistan, now, that's a great example because, as Larry mentioned, I was there in the early days. And in the case of the health sector, we had to do exactly what you challenged us to think about, and that is, how did we ensure the continual delivery of critical health care services in the midst of wanting to build capacity for the Afghans to do it themselves? And so I think, as many of you who know Afghanistan know, we, the donor community, this was not just USAID, but we worked very closely with our colleagues in the EU, with UNICEF, and with the World Bank to develop a program for the Afghans in which, at the same time as we were building their capacity to develop a health care structure, we were still funding the NGOs and the UNICEF to provide those critical health care services, without which many Afghans would have died. And so it was about balancing the need to do both. And if people know Afghanistan, I think they know that model has been proven to be one of the more successful models in which we continued to build on the delivery of healthcare services while projecting out a very real capacity of the Afghans themselves to deliver a sound healthcare policy, and over time build their capacity to work in conjunction with the NGOs. I would ask ourselves whether or not we should be building parallel social service structures at the same time as we're trying to build capacity in many of these countries. We've heard countries say, you're developing parallel systems. Yes, we may have to because we want to ensure the delivery of services, but at the same time, I go back to my point, at the end of the day, it is their country. They're going to have to develop the capacity to do it themselves.
Yes, Larry?
You asked about institutions or mechanisms, and I can't speak for the administration, but one that's gotten a lot of discussion is a quadrennial development review. The notion of perhaps 180 degrees out of phase with the acute defense review, there would be another review looking at the higher overarching sort of strategic level development questions and how we go about it. But two things that I think are already in play in a sense is managing expectations. And by that I mean weaning people from the notion that we will get immediate satisfactory results from assistance, and creating an understanding that it takes longer. And then another one that's beginning to be seen, I think, is the incentivization of development. Wouldn't it be wonderful if every one of the short-term strategic the short-term stabilization projects that SCRS or the USAID in a transitional setting puts in place was required to have a clause that forced our implementing partner or incentivized our innovating partner to do strategic development at the same time. There are a number of contracts and a number of mechanisms that are already written that way. So I think there are mechanisms already there. They're just coming into fruition. And then there may be some other policy level mechanisms that will come to be in the next few months.
Thank you. There's a gentleman over here on the right who'd like to ask a question.
Yeah, let me ask a question related to actually a presentation last year at SID, but this is Tony Pryor, by the way, with IRG. But also, first of all, I was just in Uganda last week, and one of the discussions up in northern Uganda is, is there something about our relationships pre-conflict that allows us to work better post-conflict? I mean, in other words, do we just come in after something's happened, or what are the relationships before that can make all this better? But last year, Ambassador Glilizad raised a really interesting point. He said one of the issues from his point of view for Afghanistan was that, in a way, both the military and aid have it wrong in a way. And that the issue is not, let's wait until we can find the way to have a good society in place, a good governance structure in place in terms of aid, or let's just get peace on the ground. He said, in a way, what matters is getting the peace on the ground that people feel is legitimate. It's legitimacy of the entity that's actually more important in a way than what it is. You can have the Army Corps of Engineers clean the streets, but in a way, I think what he said was, it's more important to a citizen of Kabul that somebody in Kabul helped clean the streets. So if you could talk a little bit about that too. Thank you.
Thank you. Adel?
Amen, absolutely. I would agree with you. Colleagues?
Yeah, I don't think, you're part of you're hitting at the issue of appropriate assistance. And I think, as he said, amen. But I think, and with kudos to our military colleagues and how far the military has come in the 10 years that I've been involved in this, there's now a recognition at the level of captain. I mean, young military officers understand it ain't just a matter of paving streets. It's a matter of building credibility for the host nation government and their ability to take care of their people. So they went from sewage, water, electricity, and trash as kind of the key indicators to, in Iraq, the Iraqi ability to address those things. So I think increasingly we've got it. Don't be complacent. We probably don't completely have it, but we're getting there.
Tony, you know where I stand on this. I agree completely. I think Larry's captured it very nicely. I mean, as I said in my comments, legitimacy is critical. The question is, how does the legitimacy accrue to that government with support from the various donors? But it's got to be seen as them and not us. And our role has to be carefully balanced so that we don't project ourselves too far out in front. I mean, we've talked about, whether it's in Afghanistan or Pakistan or elsewhere, about wanting the benefits of the project to be accruing to the local officials. When we, the donor community, are so visible, and which we need to be in some cases, it's hard for people to really think that's coming on behalf of the government. So again, it's that balance. We're going to be out there, we the partners, helping the locals put in place the program. The question of who gets the legitimacy on that project, well, that's something that the government is going to have to work on. It's their communication strategy at the end is going to help, not ours.
I'll make your question harder and a bit more aggressive. What you could have asked us was, how does USAID's branding strategy, insisting that we stamp from the American people on every school, lunchbox, and book bag we deliver, actually increase the legitimacy of the host nation government? And the answer is, we're not there yet. I mean, there are issues with branding. And I do wear an aid hat, and I will probably hear about this later in the day. But, there are U.S. tax dollars that we're using for this, and so there are certainly, absolutely without question, cases where this should be branded as from the American people. But I think we've been a little overzealous in that regard, and I'm looking forward to ongoing discussions about how we fine-tune that.
Thank you. We have about 10 minutes left. I see there's a gentleman who's got the mic in his hand. If there are other individuals who would like to ask a question, and I see a lady in the back here, why don't we take these last three questions so that we can allow time for the panel to respond and have any closing remarks. I see a fourth question there. We've got, let's run through them quickly and keep your questions succinct. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Adam Saffron with Management Systems International. And to build on your the last point, throughout the day, the primary themes we've been hearing are alignment and division of labor, partnerships, collaborations, leading to aid effectiveness and ownership. And so I'd like to ask a tactical question. We don't often get to be in a room with aid, state, and defense at the same time. And the question is really ownership on our side of us, and how the coordination is going to take place between the three institutions. Most of the coordination would take place more so in a post-conflict environment, but where DoD hands off to aid is unclear. States' role in the divisions between the 3Ds, and maybe it's not a fair question for you, Jim, you just got there, or a fair question, period, but it would be nice for us to know tactically how you see in a post-conflict situation the continuum of development in the roles of each of your organizations.
Thank you. Let's take another 2 or 3 questions so we can just go through these, and then the panel will have plenty to chew on.
Hi, my name is Jessica Cravan. I'm from Creative Associates, and actually my question is a little bit of a follow-on of his. And what I was wondering was, basically in an S&R situation where you see local capacity pretty low and security deteriorating, how do the 3 organizations and the implementers there on the ground, how do we modify, and who takes the lead? And if you could talk about that. And also I just wanted to say thank you for your very thoughtful comments, and I love the notion of conflict entrepreneurs.
Thank you. There's a lady in the back who's been very patient, wearing a white shirt, and then before that
I've been
gentleman.
promised next.
I'm sorry? Go ahead and ask your question, and then there's another person who had her hand up for quite some time.
Yes, I'm Leo Surla with Metametrics, and I have a fairly succinct question. Over the past 8 years, the USAID budget has increased from $10 billion to $20 billion a year. And of course, approximately half of that increase is for current conflict countries, Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, we have $10 billion a year now from PEPFAR, and about 2/3 of $1 billion a year now for the Millennium Challenge Corporation. Question is, what are the resources out of Department of Defense that are dedicated to these quasi-developmental activities? What is that number?
Thank you. Next question, please.
Me?
Yes.
I'm Lucy Phillips with IBI International, and I'm kind of surprised that you haven't mentioned Liberia much in this discussion. We've been working with the Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program in Liberia, and I think it offers some examples of where aid has gotten the timing right and had the advantage of working with good locally elected leadership. And as I see it, the timing in the transition under the transition government, 3 or 4 year initial stabilization period, there was largely donor-assisted stabilization and reconstruction going hand in hand. But once the newly elected government took over, the stabilization has remained in UN hands while local security forces are being trained. But the reconstruction, the capacity building within the institutions has been able to move fairly rapidly, in part because it was requested by the donors by the government with the donors. And I wondered whether that model is being considered in other countries. Obviously, you can't guarantee the election of strong and sound local government, but the fact that the U.S. Was the U.S. Non-direct military involvement, but the military involvement there is multilateral. It's UN peacekeeping forces.
Yes.
Was that a deliberate choice on the part of the Department of Defense?
Thank you for your question. We have just very few minutes left. I'm sorry I'm not going to be able to get to that last question, but the panelists will be here and you can come up after the panel. I'd like to let our panelists respond to these very excellent 4 questions before our time is up. Thank you. In whichever order.
We'll just go down.
Okay. I'll quickly go through the ones that are relevant to aid. We don't often speak about the successes. We tend to dwell on the countries that are less than successful, which is why we've been spending perhaps more time on Afghanistan today than on Liberia, which is, I think, a successful model. Larry and I also both worked in Afghanistan. I do not know Liberia, but that's my problem. I would note that whether it's Liberia, Rwanda, Uganda, Mozambique, countries in Latin America like Salvador and to some extent Guatemala, there are a whole host of countries that have evolved out of some form of conflict that I would say today are considered successful models of post-conflict setting. I would caution us, however, Paul Colley and others have noted that it usually takes about a good 15 years, 3 elections before you really know whether a country has successfully done that transition. And Liberia is still not out of the woods yet, but it is a successful model, and I apologize for not focusing more on the successful models. On coordination, I'm actually going to defer to Larry on that, but I would say one of the things that AID is going to be doing is spending more time on the ground, working with our state Department of Agriculture and other colleagues who may be present on the country team, working on coordinated planning through the country plans. This is something that SCRS has been pushing many of us to do. I'll let Larry talk about the details, but AID has now fully embraced this notion and is going to be spending a lot more time coordinating its own development planning on the ground. One of the things that we're also going to be doing now as part of our new business plan that we hope the new administration will also embrace is something that we used to do very well, and that is we used to put AID technical advisors into our ministries, into the ministries in countries in which we were working, whether it was somebody working in the health ministry to help build capacity or in the central bank or whatever. Obviously, in the past 15, 20 years, we've relied heavily on you, our partners, to serve as those primary counterparts. While we'll still need you as our partners, increasingly I think our new business model encourages AID officers with the right technical skills to also be out there with our technical assistance, our support, our mentoring, and working with our counterparts. Thank you.
Yeah, with respect to Liberia, I pair what Elizabeth said. I think it is a model of success with caution and caveats. I was actually in Liberia in 1979, so you can maybe understand my trepidation about jinxing it by talking too soon about successful transitions. But I think the things that you pointed out are elements of a successful way forward with respect to division of labor among the multilateral partners. I'm more interested in and obviously professionally directly interested in the question about coordination. And I think I heard you say, or as part of your question, you described, is this a continuum of development? And I'm a visual person. To my mind, it's more a choreography of development. There is no longer, in my mind, a model of defense passing the baton in a particular engagement. It's no longer the 6 phases. I go nuts when military officers present the slide that shows the 6 phases of a conflict. They're simultaneous and sequential, if that's possible to understand. An academic footnote, if you Google the expression wicked problems, it'll turn you in the direction that a lot of us are now moving in terms of how we conceptualize and talk about these post-conflict states. But instead of a continuum, imagine a very evocative or a very elaborate dance with different actors performing at front center stage at different times. And the choreography changes every time we engage. That increases the burden on our young professional officers in the military. It increases the burden on the professional officers at USAID as stewards of good development. And it increases the importance of what Elizabeth mentioned briefly, which is planning. In the past, the military has dominated our planning for engagements because they have planners and the civilian agencies, for the most part, don't. Or the planners that we do have do other kinds of planning. We are in the process of rectifying that. It's not going to happen in a year. It's probably going to happen in 3 or 4 or 5 years, but we're building civilian capacity to do that. So in the immediate term, to answer your question directly, we have a do-no-harm strategy. We don't want to mess with the young captains and the young FS3s who are doing good coordination on the ground, but we do want to build coordination at the operational and the strategic levels, which we're doing. There's an exercise literally today in Europe, Austere Challenge 09, where we're doing some of that exercising. In the midterm, there are some modest reforms that I think the administration will begin to exercise as soon as we have our political appointees in place. And then long term, there's a lot of interest in things like a quadrennial development review, the Project for National Security Reform that Jim Locker is chairing, and then the new initiatives to reconsider the Foreign Assistance Act and find ways to streamline and make that more effective and dynamic.
Thank you, Larry. And I think, Jim, you have the last word here because we're running out of time.
Larry's covered the ground exceptionally well. I would say somewhere between Larry's notion of choreography and Anne-Marie Slaughter's concept of the inherently fuzzy boundaries. I think we've captured the essence of the problem. You're right, it's not actually the handoff. It is the foreknowledge before, during, and after the handoff of what the other side needs and how they will actually respond or act once initiatives are conveyed. And that we have to be inherently civilian and military at all stages. Yeah. Does the Defense Department want to run the civilian side? No, we don't want to run it any more than President Obama wants to run Chrysler. We want to be part of it. We want to be ready, as we must be, to be there if no one else is able to deliver. The problem that poses is, of course, other people look at that and say, aha, you're worming your way into the mission. And it's a challenge, and I won't deny that. And it will take continuous efforts and oversight to work hard on establishing good common perceptions of how this all works together. A colleague here asked about DoD spending on development, quasi-development assistance. Actually, our DoD comptroller is looking at that issue. It's because there are many different resources which arguably have that capacity building effect. We know the most obvious ones, the most celebrated, well-publicized ones, Section 1206 authorities under NDAA and so forth. But it's an issue which I hope we can provide more clarity on in the near future. With respect to your question, Johanna, on QDR, Anne-Marie actually I thought over lunch, a very helpful response. We were trying to draw in and understand exactly where civilian agencies stand on these fuzzy boundaries for our own knowledge and awareness. I personally would like very much to see a quadrennial effort across the entire executive branch. There are congressional mandates to be considered, and different agencies have different response needs to Congress, as do we. But maybe in the longer term we can work together on refining the product. Thank you.
Well, I think we should thank all our panelists for doing such an excellent job in a very limited time. And maybe we can wish for a whole-of-government approach by next year's conference. I'm also, to just make a little housekeeping announcement for all of you, there's going to be a 15-minute break because this room is going to be set up for author Michael Fairbanks, who is on the next session. So again, thank you all to our excellent speakers, and thank you for SID for having me, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.